my own view is, if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, how do the Americans react here? You've got your Pacific fleet out here, but that's going to depart pretty rapidly. You're going to be very sore about the Philippines. But if you're looking at it from an American point of view, if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, you are looking at what the Japanese wanted, and that was a settlement based on the status quo at that point.
If they're out in the open doing a battle of maneuver against the Red Army, and the Red Army has preponderance in armor and artillery, I think the Red Army is going to do pretty well in this particular scenario. I could see Stalin making a calculation that, yeah, okay, if I give up a little land out here in the Far East for the time being, and that buys me the time, you know, I might even throw the Japanese a bone and say, okay, you guys can have Vladivostok if you'll just stop this war. I don't think that the Americans are going to go to war directly on behalf of the Soviet Union. There is a very healthy anti-communist vibe.
1941 is often considered the most significant year of the Second World War, and while Hitler's Operation Barbarossa was attempting to tear through the Soviet Union, to the east, Japan had a decision to make. The Imperial Command could either push further south and increase its stranglehold on the Pacific, or look north to Siberia and to the Soviet Union's Far East. An invasion plan was drawn up, but was never followed through, and mere months later, the attack on Pearl Harbor set Japan's tone for the remainder of the war. Yet, where might we have been had they pushed north and challenged the Soviets to fight on two fronts? I'm Darryl Morris, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the planned but never enacted Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It could have been one of the largest operations in history, and would its consequences have been felt all the way to the Kremlin? Those are the questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and the author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and once again, the historian and World War II scholar, Jonathan Parshall. Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Chris, for being with us. Now, before we talk about the invasion plan itself, Chris, we've got to go back a little bit and put this into context. We've got a map in front of us that helps us do that. What are we looking at?
So we've got to go back to the start of the 20th century, really, and remember that the Japanese have always had ambitions to have an empire on the mainland of East Asia, notably in China and also in Korea. Mm-hmm. And we've had a situation where the Russians and the Japanese have had a war in 1904-05, and made famous by the Battle of Tsushima, of course, which established Japan as a naval presence and power.
Covered on History Undone, of course.
Yes.
It's a great episode of that.
And a presence and power in the Far East. And we've also got to remember, at the end of the Russian Revolution, that the Japanese have occupied quite a large tract of Siberia, including the city of Vladivostok, for 4 years, with 70,000 troops. They've been on the ground. So the Japanese are showing a lot of interest in Siberia and the Russian and subsequently Soviet Far East. And we've also got to remember, at the end of the Second World War, they've got a large number of the Pacific Islands and also other concessions in, for example, what we could now call Taiwan, then Formosa. So they've got quite a lot of sort of island territories that they're being mandated with at the end of the First World War as well. And so they've got a presence both at sea and on land in that period. Now, as we progress into the 1920s and the 1930s, we see an alignment, of course, between Italy, Germany and Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact, which essentially is to contain the Soviet Union. And the Japanese set great store by this because in 1931, of course, they've entered Manchuria and established their own province of Manchukuo, as they call it, Manchuria, and they're starting to press the borders of Mongolia and the USSR. And there's all sorts of boundary disputes which culminate in 1938 with a battle at Lake Kazan. It's not a very big battle, but it's a significant battle between the Russians, the Soviets, and also predominantly Korean-based troops that the Japanese have brought across because they controlled Korea at the time. Now, a series of other disputes escalate through 1938, 1939, and it results in essentially a major incursion by a Japanese army of about probably 38,000 in a disputed territory of about 10 miles on the Kantokuen River. And essentially they're arguing over 10 miles. Now, that's quite significant in the Himalayas today. It is as we come to the end of the 1930s. And what happens is that the Japanese decide to attack a Russian airfield. And that produces a response. There are 2 subsequent attacks by the Japanese army. That encourages a response by the Russians, of course. And I think I'll leave it to John to take up the tale because it brings to the east the man who became subsequently Marshal Zhukov and a significant reinforcement of the Russians to repel this Japanese invasion. Over to you, John.
Yeah, so what basically goes down is that the Japanese have pushed across their 23rd Division, supported by a number of tank regiments, and this is all happening in like May of 1939. And lo and behold, this guy named Georgy Zhukov shows up, who was like the cavalry inspector out in, the Transcaucasus or something like that. But he shows up in Mongolia now and is given orders by Stalin to repair the situation here. The problem for Zhukov is that from a logistical standpoint, we are way out in the boonies and there is no railroad anywhere nearby. And the Japanese know that. So what Zhukov ends up doing is creating a 600-kilometer long truck route. And they use about 4,000 trucks operating mostly at night to avoid detection. And in the course of the next couple months, they build up 3 tank regiments and a number of other supporting forces, a lot of artillery too. And in August of 1939, they counterattack against the Japanese 23rd Division, and that's the map that you see on the far right here. It's a classic double envelopment using armored groups to move in behind the Japanese, and they annihilate the 23rd Division, which has a profound impact on both sides. The Japanese in particular are extremely concerned that, the Soviets have a lot of armor and artillery, and our predominantly infantry-based doctrine doesn't seem to be working terribly well against the forces that the Soviets brought to us. And the result is going to be that just at the time the Germans then invade Poland, the Soviets and the Japanese basically say, let's have a ceasefire. And the border is returned to where the Soviets say the border is, and both sides are left glaring across the frontier at each other. Chris, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things about this. Is after the first 2 attacks by the Japanese General Komatsuba, he's told he's not allowed to use his aviation. He's not allowed to use it for airstrikes, so he's got no ground support for his troops when Zhukov attacks, whereas Zhukov has mustered nearly 500 aircraft, 500 tanks, and 50,000 troops for this. So he totally overwhelms them. What's really interesting is very early on, even before Barbarossa, you see Zhukov using combined arms here. And as John says, the warrior spirit on the Japanese side doesn't actually prevail at the point of the bayonet in the face of this combined arms warfare. And of course, this double envelopment looks very much like Stalingrad later. So you can see the early seeds of this coming into Zhukov's mind and prevailing. And of course, it gives Zhukov a lot of credit with Stalin. Even at this early stage, just after virtually every other marshal and senior general has been purged. So that's the critical thing. He arrives at the top of the heap with a real success. And the Japanese, at this point, it causes the collapse of the Japanese government at the time. And what we start to see is the Navy and what we call the Southern Attack Force saying, you know what, we shouldn't be doing this. We need to hold our positions in Manchukuo. We shouldn't be pushing into Siberia, because what underpins it is the fact that the Japanese know that in, say, 1938, this area has produced nearly 27 million tonnes of oil and also about 20 million tonnes of coal as well.
Right.
So they're looking at the resources. They've thought about this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and they're looking at extending that into Siberia. What they haven't got is rubber. And this is a crucial issue. But that leads to the fall of the Japanese Empire. You see the army taking a real hit, basically, because they promised a lot and just didn't deliver. But in the back of their minds, they're saying, when we come back and do this again, we're going to do it with 7 armies and we're going to do it properly.
And John, just take us more into that then, and the sort of tussle in Japan about the sort of dominant military service.
Yeah, I mean, there's problems here between the Army and the Navy. That's the fundamental issue, is that these two services just don't get along in any way, shape, or form. And so there's this constant tug of war in terms of strategy. To sort of fast forward then to 1941, what ends up happening is that the Army begins massing troops again in Manchuria to potentially invade Siberia. They put about 700,000 troops up on the border there under the pretext of, we're doing a military exercise. But so by August of 1941, they've got, massive forces on the Soviet border. And of course, the Soviets at this point are engaged in a war against the Germans. That's just kicked off a month or two prior. But with the advent of the oil embargo by the United States, which goes down in July of 1941, the Navy basically yanks the Army's chain and says, yo, guys, we can't afford to do an invasion of Manchuria because in terms of immediate petroleum resources, there isn't a lot up there. The oil is south. It's in Java, in Sumatra. That's where we have to go. And because of the oil embargo, the Navy is successful in saying that we must execute the advance south plan rather than messing around with the Soviets. And that's why you end up getting the Pacific War in the shape that it evolves into classically.
I mean, there's another issue as well. When this war happens, the Japanese are really pretty upset that the Germans don't help them. And the Germans actually stand clear of this. So as they get into sort of 1941, they actually have a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. And by April, they've put together this non-aggression pact. And of course, that totally overturns the Comintern Pact of 1936. But the Japanese simply say, we're going to hold here. Now, the other thing that's really significant here is that in Japan, in the German embassy, you have a chap called Richard Sorge.
Yeah.
And Richard Sorge is a double agent who is feeding practically everything the Japanese are doing to Stalin. So he knows exactly that he can hold faith with the Japanese on this. And of course, where it becomes critical is it means that what they've had to deploy to the Soviet Far East doesn't have to be there all the time. And as we'll discuss later, the amount of resources that can be transferred to the West to confront Barbarossa is quite significant. And it starts with 19 divisions, of course, in December of 1941 around Moscow. They're able to take those Siberian troops and put them in. And that continues throughout the war, the fact that they don't have to hold down this frontier here.
And oh boy, does Richard Sorge play a massive role in this story and in this version of history. OK, there was a plan to go north drawn up. I think it's really worth our time having a look at that and what it involved. OK, now we're going to talk about the planned invasion itself, and this would have been a huge front line. I mean, look at this map. 5,000 kilometres wide, 1,000 deep. What an enormous sort of scope, Chris. Talk us through the plan.
So basically, the Japanese army in Manchuria, would be the basis for this. Now, there were two plans. There was a limited plan, and there was a Plan B as well. Now, the first plan was basically to surge troops out of Korea and also Manchukuo and basically cut off Vladivostok and an area which is called Primorie, which is this area here. And that would be to basically cut off Russia from the Pacific here. That was the first one. They thought they could achieve that, but they said, well, it's not gaining us access to any resources, really. So let's go for a much bigger plan, which is 7 armies, which would surge out of Manchukuo, not only into Mongolia. If they were successful in getting that far north and up into this area here, they would then surge east to Irkutsk and take the whole of Siberia up to Irkutsk. And that would take in quite a lot of the coal and the oil reserves and things like that. There was also another army that was to hold off any threat from China coming from the south. And what's critical about this plan is it actually appears in American and British planning at the time to say, look, if this is going to happen, then we certainly need to reinforce China somehow this early. So they're thinking about this. Now, the other critical thing that the Japanese were thinking is we're going to control the whole of the Trans-Manchurian Railway up to Central Asia here. And if we can, we'll get the Trans-Siberian as well. So they get the routes. Now, why didn't they go for it? Well, primarily because the Navy was sniping away at it, saying, look, but. And the Navy are the biggest critics here, saying, you've got all this wrong. The Army are saying, well, you're just naval officers, what do you know? But they're saying, just look at the logistics. You need 200,000 trucks for this. We haven't got 200,000 trucks, and you need the fuel for it. Oh, and by the way, you're going to need the cooperation of the Navy and the Naval Air Arm. Your Nate aircraft, which appeared in the previous conflict at Kantokuen Gol, they did all right, but we've got these Zeros now. They're much better. Do you want to use those? Because if you do, you'll need our cooperation for that. And so there's all sorts of tussles going on. They don't have the logistics, and they work out, in order to even get this far, they need 40 divisions. If they're going to push that way, they need 60 divisions. And so even with 7 armies, they can't get there with the troops. They don't have the armour. They don't have the logistics, they don't have the railways, and they also don't have the trucks to take people through some pretty harsh territory, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, okay.
And I think, they were dangling incentives in front of the government at the time, weren't they? And the foreign minister at the time was very, very strong in favour of this.
Yeah.
There is one final issue, is the emperor himself doesn't trust the army in Manchuria.
Right.
They keep doing stuff on their own initiative. And he says a number of times, he said, I really don't trust them.
Yeah.
We've got to keep a grip on them. John, I think there's some other issues, isn't
absolutely.
How this is going down in Japan.
Well, yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right regarding the emperor's view around the Kwantung Army, which at this point is operating essentially as a state within a state. Although in the aftermath of Kantokuen Gol in 1939, there had been a bit of house cleaning in the upper leadership of the Kwantung Army to kind of, yank their chains and bring them back into line. But Hirohito has every right to be pretty skeptical about what's going on. I think, too, that the other point that the Navy would make, and if you're going to do this on a hypothetical basis, we're doing, speculative history here, I don't think there's any credible basis for believing that the Japanese army could really advance all the way to Irkutsk, and that really any sort of military operation is going to have to be limited in scope. And you have to say to yourself that the Japanese would say, we're going to end this war at the bargaining table, and one of the terms with the Soviets is going to have to be, okay, as part of the peace treaty here, you guys are going to have to promise to supply us with enough oil to make up what we have lost through the oil embargo with the United States. At this point, the Soviet Union is tied with Venezuela as being the world's second or third largest petroleum exporter. USA is number one with a bullet. But somehow, some way, the USSR is going to have to be responsible for supplying Japan's petroleum needs, or it just doesn't make any sense to fight a major war up here in Siberia. And those are the same things that basically the Navy is saying as well. We got to go south. That's where the ready-to-hand oil is.
Right. So was this sort of dead on arrival, really?
Well, no, I mean, the Army, I think we've got to emphasise here that we're in a life and death struggle between the Navy and the Army here. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Navy's got huge prestige in Japan after the Russo-Japanese War. It's got some of the best thinkers, Yamamoto and people like that, and they're saying, look, we've got these islands, we've got these concessions out in the Pacific, we need to reach out. And we think Britain the Dutch and the French are weak at the moment because they're under attack in the West. In fact, under occupation, two of them.
Yes.
And Britain's under attack in Europe at the moment. We know that the Soviet Union's going to be engaged in the West. I agree with John. I think they thought they could force a very interesting concession here. What I'm surprised about, though, is they didn't go for the Primori plan, the first plan, to actually say, look, we're going to hold this hostage. We've had it before when we were here after the Russian Revolution. Let's hold it now as a hostage for that negotiation. So I'm surprised they didn't do that, to tell you the truth. And it was discussed, but it never came to fruition. We get into a situation where the army does get discredited in intellectual and strategic terms in 1941. They haven't come in on the side of Germany, of course, when Barbarossa happens, because we'll get you back from what happened in 1939.
Yeah.
And it's not in the Japanese interest to come in. It's as simple as that at this point. And once again, you have a change of government, and you get Tojo coming in, and the whole land strategy collapses at that point because Tojo says, I'm going with the Navy, and we're going with all the resources which we think we can get from these weak imperial powers who really can't defend themselves. Whereas, actually, you know what? We know what Russia's like. It can actually withstand us, and we don't have the logistics to get in there, as we've discussed.
The total size of the Japanese army at this point is about 53 divisions. And one of the other things that the Navy will argue is that you guys are looking at committing a war that is basically going to take every single division in the Imperial Army in order to carry this off. One of the things that we're going to do with the Strike South plan is we're only going to be asking for the resources of 11 divisions from the Army. So we're going to take all this oil down here in the South, and we're going to do it on the cheap. And it's a much lower risk proposition, at least in the immediate term, because as you say, Chris, the British and the Dutch are all weak. Vichy France will probably roll over and let us do whatever we want in terms of basing rights in Indochina. So, from a manpower commitment standpoint, the move south strategy is much more economical and does not get you into the prospect of a land war against the Soviet Union.
And we've got the Marianas, we've got the Carolines, we're building airfields, we're fortifying out into the Pacific. Why not use it?
Okay, and so Japan decide to go on the defensive in the north and on the offensive, on the attack in the south. Let's have a look at what really happened. Okay, we've considered what going north might look like, what the plan was. The truth, of course, is that Japan went south. John, talk us through this map, what we're looking at here, and what actually happened.
Yeah. So basically what ends up happening is the Japanese unleash this lightning campaign at the beginning of December of 1941, where not only do they attack Pearl Harbor, but more importantly, their emphasis is moving south. And so they unleash attacks in Malaya and begin moving down the Malayan Peninsula towards Singapore. They land troops in the Philippines. And over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, what you see happen is that the British Army collapses in Malaya. Singapore falls in the middle of February 1942. The Japanese have by then already started advancing into Burma. The noose is being cinched around Java and Sumatra, which is where the majority of the petroleum resources are. And so Java goes down in the beginning of March 1942. MacArthur's army has been pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula on the Philippines. It's going to collapse in April. And so beginning of April, you see a carrier raid by the Japanese into the Indian Ocean, which just raises bloody Cain there, pushes the Royal Navy all the way back to Mombasa in Africa. And so by the time you roll ahead to early May of 1942, the Japanese have carved out one of the largest empires in the history of mankind. And they now have all of Malaya, most of Burma, all of the Philippines, all of Java, Sumatra, and what is now modern-day Indonesia. They've pushed into New Guinea, and they just control this enormous swath of territory, not only out in the Pacific, but now on the Asian mainland as well. There are about 500 million people that are under Japanese rulership. It's a much larger empire in terms of humans than Hitler is ever going to achieve. So that's what ends up happening historically.
Right, okay. And so, Chris, what's going on in America? What are America thinking at this moment in time?
Well, the one thing that we need to mention, of course, as part of this plan is Pearl Harbor.
Indeed.
So if Pearl Harbor goes ahead to screen off the American battle force, the Americans aren't very happy about the Philippines being taken. And so I think history progresses very much as it did in that sense. One of the things we have to consider here is the Japanese can only do this, of course, because they got the agreement with the Soviets. You know, they've actually got their back protected. What is interesting, though, of course, Manchukuo, the Manchurian area, has now become the largest prison camp in the world with all these Japanese troops here. There's quite a lot holed up in here, so they haven't got a lot of strategic flexibility. They also know that America is going to come at them. They haven't got the carriers that they wanted at Pearl Harbor. They aren't able to extend down into the Solomons. And of course, as John well knows, everybody knows, Guadalcanal is the turning point there that actually says, no, we're not going to actually let you come this far. We're not going to let you cut off Australia because the Coral Sea happens. The Americans are fully engaged at this point. Their industry is mobilised. They're very indignant about what has happened at Pearl Harbor. And to be fair, it is Pearl Harbor that sets them off. My own view is if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, how do the Americans react here? You've got your Pacific fleet out here, but that's going to depart pretty rapidly. You're going to be very sore about the Philippines. But if you're looking at it from an American point of view, if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, you are looking at what the Japanese wanted, and that was a settlement based on the status quo at that point.
That's interesting, okay, because I was kind of curious about that, John, about what's going on in Japan's mind and how they are reflecting on America. You don't agree?
I disagree about that, because I would say that as soon as the Japanese invade the Philippines, this is our colony, that's a casus belli, we are absolutely going to fight. I do think that Pearl Harbor is important in terms of really incensing American sensibilities, just given, surprise nature of that attack. But there is no scenario that I can come up with, and this is the reason the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, is that they couldn't come up with a scenario either, whereby if they end up invading the Philippines, they're going to be in a war with the U.S. That's just unavoidable. And so that's the reason that Yamamoto pushes ahead with saying, well, then we got to do Pearl Harbor because we have to put their battle fleet out of commission, or we can't go to the south and grab all these goodies down here.
So, I think probably I agree with you in retrospect there, John. I've always thought, what if they hadn't gone for the Philippines? But of course, the Philippines sits between Japan and everything they've captured. So they've got to go strategically. So you're right. So if the Philippines is it's interesting. I mean, the Americans have always said that they would be committed anyway if Malaysia and the Dutch provinces were. So I guess.
And what's going on in the calculation? I'm trying to understand the calculation that they're making here, because presumably they know that, as you said, they're going to engage the United States of America, and the United States of America, with or without Pearl Harbor, has an enormous might, right?
But Yamamoto's plan is you punch him hard enough, and if they got the carriers, you're delaying the American response, for a very long time afterwards.
So delay to negotiate.
They've got to build some new aircraft carriers for a start. They've already got them in the plan, but they haven't been built at that stage. So you're delaying the American response. You can actually consolidate really hard here if it actually works. I think John's right. I mean, from an American point of view, I'm British, obviously. The Philippines is quite sensitive, but just on reflecting it, they were already committed, as I said. If Malaysia and the other British and Dutch and French colonies were actually attacked. Whether they would have delivered on that is a separate issue, to tell you the truth. I guess Pearl Harbor has to happen if you're going to take the Philippines.
Lose-lose
then,
really,
right.
John? Is it just lose-lose, basically?
Yeah, and the Japanese have come to the same conclusion. They had run war games before the war that they tried to say, okay, are there any scenarios here where we could just attach the Dutch and get away with it, or just attack the British and get away with it? And the conclusion they came to as well was any war against any one of those three powers, British, Dutch, or Americans, inevitably led to a war involving all three. And therefore, it made sense for the Japanese to pick and choose the timing of their initial attacks. That, again, is the reason that they were going to go for Pearl Harbor, because they got to basically secure their eastern flank from any sort of American counterattack driving across the breadth of the Pacific here into the flank and the rear of this southward movement to grab the oil.
But John, just can I ask you, because I have a view on this as well. The Japanese had an attritional plan for the deployment of the American fleet if it did come out anyway, if they didn't do
Yes.
Pearl Harbor. So do they take the risk of doing it without Pearl Harbor?
I think they probably would have.
I think they would have done. Yeah,
and that you then end up with a potential blue water, gun-on-gun clash somewhere in the Central Pacific, and
which was the plan. That's what they would do, wasn't it?
Plan.
Yeah.
That's right. And I don't like the American odds in that plan.
I agree.
Because, at this point, Japan's carrier force is by far the best in the world. And to an extent, we got sort of lucky at Pearl Harbor in that a lot of those older battleships just ended up in the mud, as opposed to being sunk in deep water. And, we could have lost a dozen battleships out there and thousands of sailors. It would have been a disaster.
Well,
much better to have it on the chin in
and
Pearl
if you
Harbor.
look at the way that CINCPAC was actually sort of planning during 1941, that's exactly the plan. And you can see the Japanese are attriting, to use your expression, as these things come across. And you're right, in the face of that carrier aviation, it's a Leyte Gulf in reverse, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't want that. As the Americans, I do not want to have to face up to that, because we don't have a really good understanding of just how good the Japanese carrier force is at this point in the war.
Yeah, okay. And of course the logistics. No, you don't have the tankers, you don't have the supply ships to get you across. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, at this point in the war, it's amazing. You look at some of these early campaigns, like the Battle of Coral Sea, for instance, which happens in early May of 1942. We've got a carrier force down there that's only supported by 2 oilers. And when one of those oilers is sunk, the Neosho, it basically, we got to go. Your carriers are going to run out of oil. It's time to go home. So, the logistical network at this point in time for the Americans is a real shoestring. And we don't have the ability to fight protracted campaigns with multiple carriers, zillions of miles away from home. It's just, the logistics just aren't there.
I mean, it's interesting. If you look at the Japanese records, they're actually saying if we don't attack Pearl Harbor when it's in discussion, we'll have another Tsushima. They actually say that. Yeah. And so you can see this long-distance deployment by the Americans replicating that of the Russians in 1905 and the same result happening. And that's what they're planning for.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, fascinating.
But that brings us around to, okay, what happens if we don't strike south, right? And the American Navy is still intact. Do we have any ability to intercede if the Japanese would actually move north against the Soviets? And that would be the next thing to explore.
That's tantalising then, isn't it, John? That takes us very nicely, because that is the real history behind Japan's decision not to invade the Soviet Union. Now let's do what we do best, what we love to do, and undo all of that. This is History Undone. Okay, let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone. Ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions. Had the Japanese invaded the Soviet Union, what would history have looked like? Okay, so they have gone north. None of this is happening. We can ignore all of these strategic moves. America not engaged. What is going on, Chris? Where do we start?
So we've got 7 armies engaged on the mainland. You've got the Japanese Navy, Navy Air Arm, Air Force totally engaged in not only supplying the armies in Manchuria and also pressing into Mongolia and Siberia. You've got a fully committed Soviet force there, of course, on the end of the railways and truck lines that they've got. But you've got a problem. Some of the raw materials that Japan needs aren't actually in Siberia. And the rate of production in Siberia of coal and possibly iron and also oil is not sufficient to maintain, A, this campaign, and secondly, what's going on more widely here. So my sense is that at some stage, the Japanese are going to start reaching down anyway into this area. Right. Now the key point is that do they avoid the Philippines and go for these empires? We've discussed already that we know that that would have committed the Americans anyway. The American Pacific Fleet is in the Philippines. Large number of submarines there, by the way, with non-functioning torpedoes, I might add, because at the start of the war they failed dismally. And you've got the American battle fleet here. We've discussed the vulnerabilities of going across this ocean. Now, knowing the Japanese, if the Americans had deployed, you can bet that they would have attacked it without actually declaring war, because they'd have seen that for being the threat that it was. We know how the Japanese operate. But I think quite a lot of the Navy would have been committed in this region here. Now, I think whether they reach south in conjunction with this relates to how much they can extract resources from here to keep the war going. That's the point. Now, could the Soviets have held them in the east and held off the Nazis in the west? What do you think, John?
That's the big question.
That's the $64 question, isn't it? My guess is yes. I don't want to diminish the fact that had the Japanese invaded in, let's call it August or September of 1941, that this would have presented the Kremlin with a supreme crisis, because, things are going terribly, of course, on Barbarossa, and this is absolutely the last thing that Stalin needs. That said, he's kept about 40 divisions out here in the Far East, and I have a tremendous respect for Soviet abilities in terms of combined arms, and certainly in their artillery. I grant that their divisional commanders were not all that good, but again, if the Japanese are in the mode of operations where they have to advance, they are the attackers in this scenario, and which means that they are not going to be able to dig in and defend in the same way that we see them later on in the Pacific War, where they're very good defenders. If they're out in the open doing a battle of maneuver against the Red Army, and the Red Army has preponderance in armor and artillery, I think the Red Army is going to do pretty well in this particular scenario. I just think that they've got so much more heavy equipment that they're going to be able to defend themselves.
One thing I think might be critical here, John, is the fact that all the aviation that the Japanese are going to be able to bring to this. So, they've already demonstrated their capability against China and also in Manchuria as well. You've got a lot of disembarked naval aviation here as well that's able to contribute. They're obviously going to have to hold part of their carrier force back in case the Americans do intervene at this stage. But there's a lot of aviation available, and a lot of it is top quality. So if you've got, and looking at the terrain, it's all open country and the sort of place where aviation can do a lot of damage to ground forces.
And also, John, I mean, the nature of the sort of skill set of those Soviet forces that were east, that were taken west, that partook in what was happening in Moscow, the fact that they were sort of so well trained to deal with cold weather and to deal with the harsh conditions, that was, I mean, do we not understand that as being sort of quite critical in Moscow and therefore potentially decisive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the troops that are left out here in Siberia are, of course, Siberians, and they're, perfectly cheerful to fight in the winter. And I think they're going to be better at that, frankly, than the Japanese are going to be. Two, yes, I think that in the short term, the Japanese would probably be able to benefit from their air assets. But those Japanese bomber groups that had fought in China, were bombing places like Chongqing against relatively second-rate Chinese opposition, albeit flying Russian fighters in many cases, suffered pretty heavily. And if there's one lesson that sort of came out of the early war campaigns, I would say that it became glaringly obvious that Japanese naval aviation, a lot of their bombers, you look at the Betty bomber and they call it the Type 1 flying lighter because it's just not a very defensible aircraft. And so I think that those air assets are going to be a wasting asset because the Russians are going to be able to put sufficient fighter groups into Siberia that they're going to be able to defend themselves against Japanese aviation. That you're going to lose a lot of planes relatively quickly, not only to Russian resistance, but also the weather conditions.
Yeah. The other thing I think is quite interesting here, John, is that, of course, any start of this campaign would have isolated the Soviet Far East, including Vladivostok. So you're affecting Lend-Lease here. So
correct.
So if they've cut the Russians off and they're fighting the Russians, there's no Lend-Lease coming in this way. And it's quite a lot of the Lend-Lease that they're getting. So all the other avenues through Murmansk, through Iran and places like that pale into insignificance compared to what's coming in through here. And throughout the war, of course, the Soviets were receiving quite significant amount of Lend-Lease. That stops. So they're fighting a war without the assistance of the American aid that's coming in from here.
Yeah. Okay. So is there any sort of way that the Soviets calculate that what's going on in the West is more important than the East? We've got to protect Moscow, and if Japan want a bit of land out east, so be it.
well, yeah,
yeah. I could see a scenario like that. I mean, basically, if you look at the way the Soviet Union survives Barbarossa, it is by intentionally playing a card that says, we're going to trade away 40% of our population and 40% of our economy to buy the time to live to fight another day. And so, yeah, I could see Stalin making a calculation that, okay, if I give up a little land out here in the Far East for the time being, and that buys me the time, I might even throw the Japanese a bone and say, okay, you guys can have Vladivostok if you'll just stop this war, knowing in my mind, of course, that by 44, when I've recovered my strength, I'm going to come back and crush these guys. But, that might be one way that Stalin survives to make it into 1942 is by throwing the Japanese some concessions. So hard to say.
So if that happens, I reckon the Japanese then start going south. Because they haven't penetrated far enough. Right. Okay, then they say, look, the only way we're going to get exploitable oil, minerals, and also the rubber is by going south. Yeah. So you end up with the same campaign again. So does Pearl Harbor happen later? Does it happen at all? I think it's worth bearing in mind that the scale of Soviet resources that were freed up basically by not having a war in the East. You're talking about 345,000 troops, basically, 4,000 tanks, 4,500 aircraft, 22,000 trucks, and over 80,000 horses go west. That's the scale of it that enables them to switch those resources. That's quite significant.
And Japan have what they need, the resource, to be able to fight these two fronts?
No,
they don't. And bear in mind also in 1941, you've got an 80% oil embargo by the United States. So you've got a tightening oil. So my view is that even if, I think I've already hinted at it, is even if you do advance and you do get a peace with Stalin, or indeed you carry on the war, you're going to be forced to go south anyway to pick up the resources you need to generate the fighting power to continue fighting on the mainland. Do you agree, John?
The other thing I would point out, I was just going to say that in terms of an American response, what I would do is I'd be looking to China, and I'm going to, okay, if I can't send my aid directly to the Russians via, Vladivostok or whatever, all through 1942, the Americans and the British both are looking at China as the bulwark that is going to be the manpower sump to keep the Japanese busy and keep them off the Soviets' back.
Yeah, right.
So if the Japanese have decided to go for the Soviets, my response is going to be to start pumping aid via India over the Burma Road into, and I'm going to beef up the Chinese as rapidly as I can, so that the Chinese army is now creating even more problems for the Japanese in China than we were able to historically.
And remember, if they haven't gone south, they're not in Burma. So, Britain still has Burma. You've got the Burma Road over the mountains there. They've got Korea. Certainly they've got Korea. But nothing down here is Japanese. So you've got a vast amount of material to be able to push into China, and you can put the oil, the rubber, and all the other stuff. That's why I think the Japanese inevitably have to go south, not only to cut off the supplies going through China, but also because they need it themselves.
So is there anything that brings America into this war then? Obviously, we've considered Japan going south to the Philippines and that being a trigger point. We may in our version of event not get to Pearl Harbor. So is there another way that America enters this war, John?
I don't think that the Americans are going to go to war directly on behalf of the Soviet Union. There is a very healthy anti-communist vibe. So we're happy to provide lend-lease, but we're certainly not going to put in troops, I don't think. I just don't think that's feasible. So yeah, unless American territory is itself attacked by the Japanese, I just don't see us in this war.
And and there's nothing about this that changes the sort of psychology in America. I mean, America is at this point in a sort of a very America-first mindset. Nothing about the expansion of Japan in this way changes that.
Yeah. But there's also another issue, of course. Without Pearl Harbor happening, Germany probably doesn't declare war on the United States. So you've got a situation where the United States.
Well, that's arguable too, I would say, in that it's pretty clear that by the end of 1941, Admiral Rader and Admiral Donitz both are just itching for a war against the Americans because they want us to actually have to defend the sea lanes that we have sort of unilaterally declared up to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And given the fact that we've already lost a destroyer sunk in October of 1941, the Reuben James gets sunk. So I think there's going to be a shooting war with the Germans at some point in time. It just, obviously, it was incredibly convenient from our standpoint that Hitler decided on December 11th, yeah, we're in and we're going to attack the Americans.
John, if I can just take you through a narrative there, which I think is quite compelling, is I think what is the issue at stake here is the fact that Roosevelt goes out to the American people with one of his fireside chats, and he's quite explicit. We've had this day of infamy at Pearl Harbor, and he says, let's not forget, though, this is not just Japan, it's Germany as well. And the reaction in fact, it's not in Berlin because Hitler's in the East at the time. Goebbels gets Hitler back to Berlin, and they said, we're not going to be declared war on. Because I think that's what we're picking up from that fireside chat. Great powers declare war on others. And I think that's the stimulus for Germany saying, we're going to declare war. And you're right, I agree with you. All my research tells me that Rader and Donitz are dying to get at the Americans and trying to knock them out and knock Britain out before you can mobilise properly. There's no doubt about that. But politically, I think it's just a manpower, a manhood issue saying we're not having the Americans declare war on us. We'll do it first.
I don't know. Well, and of course, you've had Klaus Schmider on your show a number of times, and he's the scholar that I really look to regarding Hitler's mindset around making that decision. And it's clear too that Hitler does not have a good sense for just how badly things are going outside Moscow, nor does he have a sense for just how badly his own war economy is performing at this point. But anyway, the net result is that the Americans do, a tremendous a gift beyond price when Hitler makes that decision. It just solves all of FDR's problems.
Okay. And certainly Churchill's.
Does it? I mean, we talk a lot about the bomb, about Hiroshima. Does it change history in that sense? Does it get dropped?
That's an interesting one. So, what is the compulsion then to knock Japan? Well, let's just think. Is it the Americans or the Soviets that actually produced the atomic bomb first? That's the issue there, isn't it? So, who has the compelling need to have a Manhattan or a Murmansk project? That's an interesting one, isn't it?
I tend to think it's still the Americans.
I agree.
Are clearly going to get, from the bottom line, from just a resource allocation standpoint, there is no other nation on the planet at this point that has a spare $2.2 billion to just toss away on a speculative venture that may or may not work. If you look at the situation of the Soviet Union in 1942, I mean, there is no way in hell that they are going to, they don't have the uranium, they just don't have any of that stuff.
And they're not working on it, John. Whereas the Germans did think about it, but then abandoned it, of course, because they had other projects. Right. So they don't even have the impulse to do it. Given the fact how far the Germans drove into the Soviet Union, you'd think it would stimulate the impulse to go for the device. I think, well, what stage do we think the Americans kick this off, John? In a scenario where they're not engaged in the Pacific, they're lend-leasing through China. Do they provoke? Perhaps the Japanese actually say they're so involved in China, we've got to go to war with them anyway.
That's an interesting notion. I think if you posit a scenario whereby the Americans decide, okay, we want to pick a fight, we're not going to do that until substantially most of the warships that are being paid for by the Two Ocean Navy Bill are now at sea, and so that brings us to like mid-1943 or something like that. At a certain point in time, our Navy is going to be just unchallengeable in the Pacific, and the Japanese know that, of course. So I can't see us wanting to pick a fight until 43.
Yeah. So everything gets delayed. I think we're pushing the war almost into late 40s, maybe even 1950s in that sense.
So,
right.
So this is one of those the episodes of History Undone where really, actually, sort of most of what comes to pass. A different timeline, different motivations, perhaps.
Well, I think, Darryl, at the end of the day, I think if they go into Mongolia and they go into the Soviet Union, I still think they've got to go south.
So basically, they've got to go south.
Yeah.
That still engages America. We still sort of end up where we...
But it's how and when America engages is the issue, I think.
Right.
If they bypass the Philippines and say to the Americans, look, let's be friends on this, let's get at the resources. But I get back to the point we agreed with John that the Americans said, if you go for Britain, France, and the Dutch colonies here, then we're in as well. It's as simple as that. I think also, if you lend-lease through China to China and possibly also up to Russia as well, the Japanese are going to say, we're going to start interdicting that. What's the next response to that? We're going to start protecting the lend-lease. And then you build up your Navy and you say, we're going to start pecking along. What I think is interesting is if they do go south and America's not in the war and they start reaching down towards Australia and into the Solomons and things like that, the Japanese have got a free run for a while.
So, John, final question.
Sorry, on that.
Yep.
The other issue is the Americans might think that the link with Australia is a red line as well, because that's getting into our hemisphere big style. Yeah. So that may have provoked the Americans coming in regardless.
So, John, I described 1941 as being this sort of pivotal moment, big, important year. Go on, how pivotal?
Well, and of course, I'm the guy that's working on a book on why 1942 is the pivotal year in the war, but no, there's no question that 41, I would say, is pivotal in terms of setting in train a lot of the political dynamics that are going to end up leading to, the American involvement in the war. The reason I would say 42 is more pivotal is because it's the first year in which now all the big dogs are in this fight, that you really can't sort out this war until both Japan and the Americans are now fully involved. But it is the events of 41 that put in train all of these eventualities that are going to lead to American involvement.
I've just got one issue, John, that I appreciate your view on. If this land campaign does happen, knowing how bureaucracies operate, the resources will be sucked away from the Navy to support this war on land quite significantly. And at what point does Japan say, our Navy's getting so hollowed out and weak now, we can't actually face an American involvement here? And how do they keep the balance between the Navy and the Army? The Navy's almost got to say, even though we're involved in land, they'd be pushing this southern scenario for their own survival alone as a service, quite apart from the resources in the South.
No, I think that's a good point. And the Navy, of course, can point to the fact that they understand the implications of the Two Ocean Navy Bill, which was passed in July of 1940. I mean, they're going to be like, guys, we can use our Navy now, but we're not going to be able to use it in 43.
That's it.
There's nothing we're going to be able to do to prevent American superiority in the Pacific in terms of warships. And so if you're serious about wanting to grab oil in the short term, you have to go with our strategy, which again is advance south.
So you could end up with Japan with a two-front war, both in the south and in the north. Yeah,
which is even more potentially disastrous for them because By the time you get to 1943 and the Red Army has basically resurrected itself, the Soviets by then would have substantial resources to be employing in a campaign in the East. It means that they maybe don't end up getting to Berlin as quickly as they do historically, but it means that the Japanese are now involved in a land war against the Red Army, and that is the last thing that they should want.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. And I think a lot of roads lead south inevitably, anyway, basically.
The Japanese made the right decision.
Yeah.
But possibly the Pearl Harbor bit they could have done without.
Yeah, maybe. Blimey, how interesting. I think that's what we've got time for on this episode of History Undone. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Jonathan Parshall. Thank you so much for being with us on this episode. Thanks. Well, thank you, Jonathan. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow this show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast app. Until next time, bye-bye.